Hello again. This is Bob Rogers, and today I'm delighted to be conducting an online interview with John Van Gessel. I actually can't remember how many years I've known John, but John, until his retirement a couple of years ago, was the cargo business support manager for Air New Zealand. John actually did 50 years, that's 50 years working for Air New Zealand before he did retire. And one of his responsibilities was ULD. And we're talking today with John because Air New Zealand, many years ago, back in 1998, established a system for charging demurrage for ULDs moving off airport in Auckland to the various freight forwarders located around Auckland Airport. So welcome, John. And very nice to have you and to tap your extraordinary knowledge. And my first question, John, to you is, can you recall what it was that motivated Air New Zealand to actually go ahead and set up this demurrage program, because it was unusual at the time?
Yes, I think at the time, Air New Zealand probably had a combination of events happening in Auckland that maybe is relatively unique. One, Air New Zealand carried at least a third of the air freight into and out of Auckland. So that we were a big player in the Auckland market. But not only was it Air New Zealand, but we were also the ground handler at Auckland. And for that, probably there was around 90% of wide-bodied aircraft cargo moved through Air New Zealand's handling facility. So that's a huge statement in itself. So there was only a few minor, mostly Pacific Island type carriers that we weren't handling. We nearly handled all the wide-bodied carriers at that time. And it's against that background that the needs happened. At the same time, the 80s and the 90s was an era where air freight pricing incentivized containerization. And a country like New Zealand, it was absolutely taken hold of. And in New Zealand, the probably 70% of our exports, and they consist of perishable products like meat, fish, vegetables, flowers, were containerized. So that's a huge amount of containers were given to us as containers rather than loose loaded freight. And at that time, probably around 40% of the freight coming into New Zealand was containerized. Admittingly, that was very largely from Australia, where New Zealand and Australia were in a similar position. Containerization had really taken off between those two countries, and to a degree from the USA to New Zealand, between New Zealand and Australia and the USA, containerization was big. Another event that happened in the 90s was freight forwarders were starting to emerge from smaller operators, being just freight agents, to international conglomerates. And all of a sudden we saw these big names from overseas taking up residence in New Zealand, and that gave them the ability to do containerization. All those things combined together, and so we had, like overall 60% of the freight that moved through our terminal, and we were the major carrier, was already containerized. So you can imagine how many units were off station at any one time. And that really presented a challenge for us in terms of maintaining station stock. If you theoretically should have had a pallet stock of 100 pallets at any one time on station, and you've got 60 or 70% of them off station, it becomes a challenge if you can't get them back in a timely fashion. And so that was the background that motivated Air New Zealand for taking the step of introducing controls for containerization. I mean, we had a significant workforce involved in station stock management, not just for ourselves, but for all the carriers that we handled. And you had to do that Monday stock check that was required. That was a real difficulty. You had to go, they spent all day traveling around the freight forwarders trying to count their numbers. And then, it became very difficult when things went off, because if you can think about it, if the freight forwarder now has a truck with a roller bed on it, and he's got to go and pick up meat from a meat processor, that truck's it's much easier for the meat processor to have the pallets sitting at their place, and they put it on and so forth. So you can see what happened in reality, and while what we were starting to lose control. Perhaps I can tell the little story. We had a phone call, and I was there, a phone call from the local police department. They just raided a biker gang, and all our pallets were being used as a fencing around the around the headquarters of the gang. And the freight forwarder who had that pallet stack stolen from them didn't even know. And worse was, we didn't even know the freight forwarder had the pallets stolen from them. And so it wasn't only our pallets, it was other handle carriers' pallets. And they were happily used as a fence in the thing. So you can see the colour that against which we decided to create some sort of system that we could manage.
Wow, interesting times. So moving that along, what did it take? I know you guys invested in an IT system, which I believe is still to this day running. But beyond that, what did it take to get it up and get this up and running?
At this time, the need was started to be identified, and certainly from a ground handling perspective, the need was shown to be there. One, you were using an awful lot of resource to try and manage them, and we weren't doing it well enough because we didn't really have control. And you then could see that, yes, we needed to come up with a system, because salespeople would ring up and say, we can't, we've got a flight going out tomorrow night and the freight agent hasn't got a pallet. And you were then responding to those sort of pressures. And remember, all our ground handled carriers had the same idea. So what we then said is, we could identify the need, and we sat down with our ground handled carriers as well, because you wanted it as a collective need to identify the features and benefits of it. Remember, these ground handlers had limited staff. Often there's only an office of 2 or 3 people, and the last thing their staff would enjoy was spending all their time trying to find their pallets. Yeah. So everybody had the same problem. And so we then said, okay, if we come up with a system like we then would do it, we try and do something that's quite simple, and we then because we ended up with a flat charge for every unit. Even if it was an LD7 versus a pallet versus a LD3, you had exactly the same charge, and it was a flat $50 a day after 3 days. And so, because it never was motivated to try and earn money, it was motivated to try and exercise some control over the equipment that you had. And so it was a good sell to the handle carriers as well as our own management. Obviously, where we did come unstuck a bit was with the salespeople, but that's a different story. The system we used was actually, it was an access system. So it was developed in-house. Remember, we're talking around 2000, 1998, 99, and 2000. So it was an internally access developed system. And that's a long time ago, and very much the system produced a paper transaction, it did that, and we had in and out and so forth. So you can't look at it. It's only in about 7 years ago we used Core to upgrade the system into the system they provided. So they took the access system, because access is really a legacy system these days. It's now, and they took it to their system and put a few whistles and bells on it, i.e. BLE tags and a few other bits and pieces. But so that was how it all developed. We did do a trial period, and it was meant to be a 6-month trial period. I've got to say that it took more than 2 years to get it through, because what you've got to learn to do is you've got to look at it from commercial side and an operating side, not too much from an international selling side, because all the salespeople had day-to-day contact with the freight forwarders, and none of them want to pay any money. So we had the system operating, effectively telling the freight forwarder, you owe us $300,000 this month, because that's how many days you've had things. It was only a fictional amount of money. And in the early days, some of them were in huge numbers because nobody was behaving. And it was with the size of the threat that we got them to reduce their times. So it took us almost 2 years to physically then say, right, from this day on, you have to do it. And we had to really tell the salespeople, you can't interfere. It's Air New Zealand as a ground handler that's operating it, not Air New Zealand as a carrier. And once that got through, it worked very well.
Wow, I think
it's been going for 22 years it's been operating.
And yeah, as I say, I often use it as an example of how such a system is both necessary and can be successfully implemented. So, and I think you've probably answered my next question, what were the results? But do you have any hard numbers? I mean, would you say that it significantly improved the return rate of the equipment? Did you get it?
I think overnight, once, because it was a trial period, it took time to reduce, but once you actually had dollars into it, overnight, it changed it. And I can tell you one example that just occurred to me. Once we automated it, and this is more in recent years with the BLE tagging and so forth, the freight forwarders would bring the pallets into the container park to clock them in, only so they could take them out again.
Okay.
So you can, yes, and it's our bad that we let that happen, but that's just one of the weird side effects. Freight forwarders take it very seriously when there's a penalty.
Yeah, well,
they would do that. And I tell you who we got on very well with was the handled carriers. They were more than happy that we had the system. Remember, Air New Zealand actually kept the money of the ground handled carriers. The quid pro quo for that was, if we lost one of our handled carriers units, they then could come to us and we would have to pay for a new unit.
Okay.
A replacement unit. So you see, it was in a sense, it was win-win. We ended up with a pool of money, but the freight forward, the handled carriers could do it. And so, in fact, the local handled carriers were very happy with it because it meant less work for them. We probably ran into more problems with some people in corporate from the handled carriers who then, at a helicopter view, said, why should you be getting some of our money? You see, they didn't understand that it's actually not about the money. No. It's actually about control. And so that was some of the findings, things. We certainly reduced our staff hours in managing ULDs. Air New Zealand had very few staff on the ground managing that was their sole job. And I can remember going across the Tasman and seeing the carrier over there. They had a whole office full of staff trying to manage ULDs.
Yeah.
And technically, often I was the only person, and mine was a helicopter view. Sure, we had a couple of guys in the container park, signing the units in and out and operating the system. And as units left our handling facilities, we had staff doing that. But we got away from the need to have a little workforce of unique ULD people.
Yeah.
And that's what a huge benefit to us that was. So there was lots of wins on that. Of course, the downside is you're only as good as the operators. And, we can have the A shift and the B shift. And the A shift does everything all right. And you have the B shift who can't be bothered signing the unit out, or signing it back in. So we had, luckily, the core system, when we got that improved in about 2015, 16 or thereabouts, it addressed some of those because it was able to then go into the UCR's messagings, and it would pick up containers of all our handle carriers and say, oh, it's operating now, so it must be back. One of your staff members. So you see how recent technology has really allowed us to greatly improve the quality of output and make up for individuals letting us down.
Yeah. Well, no, that's very clear, John. Thank you for that. And I mean, I think the answer to my next question, which is, would you do it again? The answer to that is unequivocally, I think, yes. I mean,
I will have one qualifier with that. I think technology has advanced so much that what we're operating as a legacy system that is no longer realizing the potential, and we have staff doing keystrokes unnecessarily.
Yep.
So my answer to that is, I don't think our system meets the current needs or the opportunity that's available. And so that's the qualifier I would make, rather than saying it's great, everybody should buy a system. It's the last thing you want to do. It's an old system that still has far too many keystrokes that are unnecessary.
I would completely subscribe to you on that, John. And I mean, digitalization is the subject. And of course, pallet identification is still stuck in the 1970s with, it's a big challenge for the industry. So yes. Okay, as a last question, because I'm keeping an eye on my time, have you got any words of advice for the rest of the industry in this regard, on this subject? What would be your thoughts?
I think that what we've got to realize is that standalone systems, that era has passed. So an Air New Zealand operating system in Auckland for ULDs, that time's passed. Because what I want to think is, we have the same needs, for example, we had in London or in Los Angeles, and exactly the same needs, but we had a ground handler in London that was operating the system. We've got ground handler in Los Angeles that is doing they're using some sort of system, but our current system can't see what they're doing. It doesn't interface with that. And if I can use the example, Bob, when we have, out of New Zealand, we have an export program, all carriers, so we can share that with everybody, have a huge export programs of meat a couple of times a year. Easter and in October, the new lamb season comes through, and hundreds of pallets every week depart New Zealand shores on all carriers going there. And you can imagine in New Zealand, who used to fly to London, it no longer does. But when we used to fly to London, we had far more, we only had one flight a day to London, but we had 3 flights a day to Los Angeles, 1 to San Francisco, 1 to Houston, or several times a week to Houston, several times a week to Chicago. And we would send pallets of meat for London or for to be on forwarded to out of London to internal UK or across the continent by truck to Paris and Amsterdam and Frankfurt and so forth. And so we would have all these pallets going out, very few that just went on a direct flight to London. And you can imagine 100 or more pallets, Air New Zealand pallets, getting to London in a week, and not one of them was for the ground handler there. They'd all be put on a truck from a freight forwarder's truck or a trucking, refrigerated trucking company's truck. Off it would go. The ground handler may have, hopefully, has done a little receipt to the freight forwarder saying you've got my pallet, but they don't report that back to us. We had no idea where those pallets are gone, and we're all too busy doing our own thing to worry about it until someone screams, I need another pallet stack. But I would look at the system, but you've got 100 pallets sitting there. And he then would send me a photograph of his container park, and there was one single pallet. Look at that, he would say. I'm not lying. You're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. And of course, the guy in London is only worried about what goes out. He's not worried about the stuff coming in. So it's not his problem that all these pallets went off station to internal. And he can't understand why I'm saying, you've got all these pallets. You've got to go to all these people and get them back. Yeah. And it's not the ground handler's problem in London either. So you can see as a carrier from a commercial corporate level, you've got to say, I've got to come up with a solution that's beyond that. And so I'm saying that you need now an integrated system that provides features and benefits for all participants, for the freight forwarders, for the ground handlers in particular, and even for some of your shippers and consignees. So everybody has got the ability to see what's happening with their product, with the actual activity, and we can come up with red flags saying, you've got a problem here, Houston. You've got to get those 100 pallets back on station. And this is who's got them. And this is the phone call of the person who's got them, and get onto it. So you see what the opportunity is. So the answer is, my advice to others is help invest in a system that's going to bring you wins and minimal cost.
Yeah. John, thank you. Great words. And from a person who's walked on this particular track. I mean, as I say, I often refer to the Air New Zealand as an example of a successful program for managing these off-airport ULD assets. And listening to you this morning, it's great. Really, thank you very, very much, John. As you know, as I've talked to you, ULD Care is working hard to try and realize many of these ambitions that you've talked about. And I really thank you for your contribution. Thank you very much.
Okay then, Bob. Catch you later.